The blood on Lyra Stormwind's apron had long since dried to rust when she heard the horse stumble past her cottage gate. Its rider slumped forward like a sack of grain about to spill. She set down her mortar and pestle, grinding willow bark for Mrs. Henderson's rheumatism, and wiped her hands on the cleanest corner of her apron. Through the single window of her one-room dwelling, she watched the stranger sway dangerously in his saddle. His uniform, what remained of it, bore the deep blue of the Union Army. Though it was so torn and mud-caked, she could barely make out the insignia. Another one, she thought, her heart doing that familiar dance between compassion and wariness. Since the war had crept closer to their Missouri Valley, wounded soldiers had become as common as autumn leaves, and just as likely to be swept away by the next harsh wind. The horse, a bay mare with intelligent eyes and foam at her bit, seemed to understand her rider's predicament better than he did. She picked her way carefully up the dirt path, stopping just short of the wooden steps where Lyra now stood, her medical bag already in hand. "Sir," Lyra called softly, not wanting to startle him. "Sir, you're hurt." The soldier's head lifted slowly, revealing a face that might have been handsome before exhaustion and pain had carved deep lines around his eyes. Those eyes, gray as winter storm clouds, focused on her with obvious effort. "Ma'am," he managed, his voice rough as sandpaper, "I don't mean to trouble you. Just need." His words trailed off as he swayed again, and Lyra stepped forward instinctively. "Easy now," she murmured, the same tone she'd used to gentle the wounded creatures she'd tended since childhood. First the barn cats and injured birds, then the people who came seeking her late father's medical knowledge, and finally the endless stream of broken soldiers the war kept delivering to her door. She'd been alone in the world for 3 years now, since consumption had taken both her parents. Within a month of each other. At 22, she possessed her father's healing hands and her mother's stubborn heart, though precious little else. The cottage, built by her grandfather's own hands, was hers free and clear, along with the small garden that kept her fed and the reputation for doctoring that kept her useful to her neighbors. The soldier, barely more than a boy, really, despite his lieutenant's stripes, managed to dismount without falling, though he gripped the saddle horn like a lifeline. "What's your name, soldier?" Lyra asked, slipping under his left arm to support him. He was tall, probably 6 feet, and lean in the way of men who'd been living on hardtack and hope. "Kalen," he said after a moment's hesitation. "Kalen Viral." She noticed the pause, filed it away with the other small mysteries that soldiers carried like invisible wounds. Men came to her door with all manner of secrets, and she'd learned not to pry too deeply. A man's past was his own business. His present injuries were hers. "Well, Lieutenant Viral, let's get you inside before you collapse in my dooryard and frighten the chickens." He might have smiled at that. She caught a flicker of something that wasn't pain crossing his features, but then they were navigating the narrow doorway, and his breathing grew labored with the effort. Her cottage was simple but clean, everything in its place by necessity rather than nature. The main room served as kitchen, parlor, and surgery combined. A narrow bed occupied one corner, separated from the rest by a faded quilt hung on a rope. Her father's medical books lined a single shelf, their leather bindings worn smooth by countless consultations. She guided Kalen to the room's only chair, a sturdy oak piece her grandfather had made, then lit the oil lamp on the table. The golden light revealed what daylight had only hinted at. This man had been through hell. His right side was dark with dried blood, and his left arm hung at an odd angle. Fever flushed his cheeks, and she could see the telltale tremor in his hands that spoke of blood loss and exhaustion. "When did you last eat?" she asked, already moving to stoke the fire in her small stove. "Tuesday, I think." His voice was growing weaker. "Maybe Monday." Today was Friday. Lyra felt that familiar tightening in her chest, the same feeling she'd had watching her parents fade, powerless to save them despite all her father's teachings. But this man wasn't dying of consumption. This man could be helped, if she acted quickly enough. "I'm going to tend your horse first," she said, noting his look of alarm. "She's a good mare, and she brought you this far. 5 minutes to get her settled, then I'll see to you properly." She moved efficiently, years of practice making her hands steady even as her mind raced. The mare was indeed a fine animal, well-trained and gentle despite her obvious exhaustion. In the small lean-to that served as her stable, Lyra rubbed the horse down and gave her oats and water, all the while thinking about the man in her cottage. There was something about him that didn't quite fit. The quality of his boots, the way he'd hesitated over his name, the careful way he watched her even through his pain. But then, the war had mixed up men from all walks of life, thrown them together in ways that peacetime never would have. When she returned to the cottage, she found Kalen exactly where she'd left him, though his eyes had closed and his breathing had grown shallow. "Lieutenant," she touched his forehead, burning with fever. "I need you to stay awake while I examine you." His gray eyes opened, fixing on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You're an angel," he whispered. Lyra felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm just a woman with some medical training and a stubborn streak. Now, let's see about getting you out of this uniform." But as she began to carefully peel away the blood-soaked fabric, she discovered something that made her hands still and her heart race. The uniform wasn't Union blue at all. Lyra's hands trembled as she peeled back another layer of the blood-soaked fabric. Beneath the mud and gore, the telltale gray wool of a Confederate uniform emerged like a ghost from a grave. Her breath caught in her throat. Here, in Missouri, a state torn between North and South, harboring a Confederate soldier could mean death. Her neighbors had already lost 2 sons to the Union cause. The Henderson boy had come home in a pine box just last month, and old Mr. Garrett still wore a black armband for his eldest. Kalen's eyes had drifted closed again, his breathing shallow and labored. Fever painted his cheeks crimson, and she could see the life bleeding out of him with each passing moment. Whatever uniform he wore, whatever side he'd chosen in this terrible war, he was dying, and Lyra Stormwind had never let anyone die on her watch. Not if she could help it. "Lord, forgive me," she whispered, then set her jaw with the same determination that had carried her through 3 years of solitude and loss. She reached for her father's surgical scissors and began cutting away the uniform in earnest. The wounds beneath made her stomach clench. A rifle ball had torn through his right side, missing vital organs by mere inches, but leaving a gaping hole that wept blood and clear fluid. His left shoulder was dislocated, the joint swollen purple-black. Smaller cuts and bruises painted a map of violence across his chest and arms. But it was the scarred brand on his left forearm that made her pause, her breath catching. The mark was old, deliberate. The letter D burned deep into flesh. She'd heard whispers of such things, punishment marks given to military deserters, though she'd never seen one. What manner of man had she brought into her home? Kalen stirred, his eyes opening to find her staring at the brand. Something flickered across his face, shame, perhaps, or defiance. "You should turn me out," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Before someone sees." "Hush." Lyra dipped a clean cloth in warm water, her movements sure despite the chaos in her mind. "I've seen enough death to know it when it's knocking. You'll not leave this world on my watch, uniform or no uniform." She worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning the wounds with carbolic acid that made him hiss between clenched teeth. The rifle ball had passed clean through, a mercy, though the damage it left behind would test all her skills. "This will hurt," she warned, threading a curved needle with silk thread. "Everything hurts," he replied, but there was something almost like humor in his gray eyes. "Have at it, Angel." That word again. Heat crept up her neck as she began stitching, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened when he watched her work. She'd tended dozens of wounded men, but none had ever looked at her quite like this, as if she were something precious instead of simply useful. The morning sun climbed higher as she worked, and with it came the sounds of the waking valley. Mrs. Henderson's rooster crowing, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of wagon wheels on the main road that passed a quarter-mile from her cottage. Normal sounds of normal life, while she harbored a Confederate soldier in her kitchen. "There," she said finally, tying off the last stitch. "Now for your shoulder." She'd reset dislocated joints before. Her father had taught her well, but it always required trust between doctor and patient. Kalen would have to let her hurt him to heal him. "This will be the worst of it," she warned, positioning her hands carefully. "I need you to relax your arm completely. Fight me, and I might do permanent damage." He nodded, those storm gray eyes never leaving her face. "I trust you." The simple words hit her harder than they should have. When had anyone last trusted her with something that mattered? Her neighbors came to her for tonics and poultices, minor hurts that wouldn't heal on their own. But this man, this enemy soldier, was placing his very future in her hands. She counted to 3, then threw her weight into the motion. Kalen's body went rigid, a strangled sound escaping his throat, but he didn't fight her. The joint slipped back into place with an audible pop. "Sweet Mary," he gasped, sweat beading his forehead. "I think you've just saved my arm." "The Lord's own truth is I might have," Lyra replied, already reaching for clean bandages. "Though you'll be weak as a kitten for days yet." She helped him ease back in the chair, noting how the pain lines around his eyes had already begun to soften. Color was returning to his face, and his breathing seemed easier. "Why?" he asked suddenly. Lyra paused in her bandaging. "Why what? Why? Help me? You know what I am, what I represent." His voice carried a weight that spoke of more than physical wounds. "Your neighbors would understand if you turned me away." She considered the question as she secured the bandages, her hands moving with automatic precision. Why indeed? The safe answer would be her Hippocratic duty, the oath her father had taught her about healing all who needed it. But looking into those gray eyes, she knew the truth ran deeper. "Because," she said slowly, "this war has taken enough good men already. I'll not have another death on my conscience when I could have prevented it." Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or relief. "You don't know that I'm good." "No," she agreed, helping him ease his injured arm into a sling fashioned from an old petticoat. "But you haven't tried to harm me, despite being twice my size and armed." She'd noticed the pistol at his hip, though she'd left it there. "You thanked me for tending your horse before yourself. And you told me to turn you out rather than risk my safety." She moved to the stove, ladling broth from the pot that had been simmering since dawn. "That speaks to character, uniform aside." Kalen accepted the bowl with his good hand, inhaling the rich scent. "You're a remarkable woman, Miss Stormwind." Lyra Stormwind. She settled into her father's old chair across from him, suddenly aware of how intimate this felt. Sharing a meal with a man in her kitchen, tending his wounds, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Stormwind," he repeated, as if testing the name. "It suits you. Strong and beautiful, with just a hint of wildness." Heat flooded her cheeks again. "You're fevered. You don't know what you're saying." "My fever's breaking, thanks to you. And I know exactly what I'm saying." He took another spoonful of broth, his eyes never leaving her face. "How long have you been alone here?" The question caught her off guard. 3 years. Since my parents passed. And no husband? No suitors beating down your door?" Lyra felt her defenses rise. "The war has taken most of the young men. And those who remain," she shrugged, "they want wives who'll tend their homes and birth their children. They don't much care for women who can stitch wounds and set bones." "Fools," Kalen said quietly. "Every last one of them." Before she could respond, the sound of horses approaching made them both freeze. Multiple horses, moving at a steady pace up the main road. Lyra rose quickly, moving to the window. "Union Patrol," she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. 6 men, heading this way. Kalen struggled to rise, his face going pale. You have to sit still and let me think." Lyra's mind raced. The patrol was still a quarter mile away, but they were definitely turning toward her cottage. Someone must have seen the strange horse or noticed the lamp burning late into the night. She moved quickly, gathering up the bloodied uniform pieces and shoving them into her father's old medical bag. "Can you walk?" "If I have to. The route." "Cellar," she said, helping him to his feet. "It's hidden beneath the kitchen floorboards. Small but dry. You can hide there until they pass." They moved together toward the concealed entrance, her supporting his weight. But as she lifted the boards, revealing the dark space below, Kalen caught her hand. "If they find me," he said urgently, "tell them I forced you. Tell them I threatened you, made you tend my wounds. Don't let them blame you for my choices." Lyra looked into his eyes, seeing something there that made her chest tight. "They won't find you. But if they do, they won't," she repeated firmly. "I give you my word." He squeezed her hand gently, then disappeared into the darkness below. She replaced the boards, scattered a rug over them, and had just smoothed her hair when the knock came at her door. "Miss Stormwind." A familiar voice, Captain Thorn Ironvale, The Union officer who'd been stationed in their valley for the past 6 months. A word, if you please. Lyra opened the door with what she hoped was the right mixture of surprise and welcome. Captain Ironvale, what brings you by so early? The captain was a lean man with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair. He'd always been respectful in his dealings with the local folk, which made him more dangerous, a man who might notice details that others would miss. We've had reports of a Confederate deserter in the area, he said, his gaze moving past her into the cottage. Wounded, likely seeking medical attention. Have you seen anything unusual? Lyra felt the live form on her lips, bitter as wormwood. Nothing, Captain. Though if such a man did come seeking help, you'd turn him away, of course, the captain said. But there was something in his tone that suggested question rather than statement. I'd do my Christian duty, she replied carefully. But as the captain's eyes swept her kitchen once more, she couldn't shake the feeling that he sensed exactly what that duty might entail. Captain Thorn Ironvale stepped into her kitchen. Without invitation, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. Lyra's heart hammered so loudly she was certain he could hear it, but she forced herself to remain calm as his eyes swept the room. Your fire's burning mighty hot for such a warm morning, he observed, noting the steam rising from her washpot. Laundry day, Lyra replied, gesturing toward the pile of linens she'd hastily thrown together to hide the blood-stained rags. And I was brewing willow bark tea for Mrs. Henderson's joints. The captain nodded, but his gaze lingered on the oak chair where Kaelin had been sitting just minutes before. A few drops of blood still glistened on the seat, dark as guilt. Mind, if my men water their horses at your well? He asked, though his tone suggested it wasn't really a question. Of course not. Lyra moved toward the door, hoping to draw him away from the concealed cellar entrance. Shall I bring them some fresh bread? I baked yesterday. That's kind of you. But instead of following her outside, Captain Ironvale wandered toward her father's bookshelf, running his finger along the spine of a surgical manual. You've quite the medical library here. My father was the valley's doctor. I learned what I could. So I've heard. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Folks say you have healing hands, that you've tended wounded soldiers from both sides without asking questions. The words hung in the air like smoke from a pistol shot. Lyra felt the blood drain from her face, but she kept her voice steady. I tend anyone who needs tending, Captain. It's what my father taught me. A noble sentiment. He moved closer to the table, where her medical bag sat partially open, though some might call it treasonous. And what would you call it? Captain Ironvale studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes, so different from Kaelin's storm-dark ones, seeming to weigh her very soul. I'd call it human decency, which is why I hope you'll understand when I tell you that harboring enemy soldiers, even wounded ones, puts you in grave danger. I understand the risk, Captain. Do you? He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Miss Stormwind, there are men in my command who've lost brothers, sons, fathers to Confederate bullets. They wouldn't hesitate to burn this cottage to the ground if they suspected you of giving aid and comfort to the enemy. Beneath the floorboards, Kaelin would be hearing every word. Lyra could only pray he wouldn't do something foolish like try to surrender himself to protect her. Is that a threat, Captain? It's a warning. His expression softened slightly. From someone who's seen too much senseless death already. Whatever your father taught you about duty to the wounded, these are dangerous times. The wrong choice could cost you everything. Before Lyra could respond, one of his men appeared in the doorway. Captain, we found something you should see. Lyra's blood turned to ice water. They'd found Kaelin's horse. She followed the captain outside, her legs feeling wooden. Behind her cottage, near the lean-to stable, Sergeant Orrin Steelstride held the reins of the bay mare. The horse was beautiful even in exhaustion, her line speaking of good breeding and careful training. Found her grazing in your pasture, the sergeant said. Fine animal. Too fine for these parts, I'd say. Captain Ironvale circled the mare slowly, his experienced eye taking in every detail. Confederate cavalry mount, unless I miss my guess. See the way she's trained? Neck reining, perfect response to leg pressure. This is a war horse. Perhaps she wandered off from a battlefield, Lyra suggested, her mouth dry as dust. Lost horses turn up here sometimes, with fresh oats in her belly and brush marks on her coat. The captain ran his hand along the mare's flank. Someone's been caring for this animal recently. Very recently. The other soldiers had formed a loose circle around them, their faces hard with suspicion. These were men who'd seen friends die, who'd learned to trust no one and question everything. Lyra could feel their hostility like heat from a forge. "Search the property," Captain Ironvale ordered. "Barn, stable, anywhere a man might hide." "Captain," Lyra said, desperation creeping into her voice despite her efforts to stay calm. "Surely you don't think? I think that horse didn't get here by magic." His gray eyes were flint-hard now. "And I think you're a poor liar for such. A good woman." The soldiers spread out with military precision, two heading for the stable, one toward her small barn, another circling the cottage itself. Lyra watched them with growing dread, knowing it was only a matter of time before they found some trace of Kalen's presence. She was so focused on the search that she almost missed the subtle hand signal Captain Ironvale gave to Sergeant Steelstride. The older man nodded once, then began walking deliberately toward the cottage's front door. "No," Lyra breathed, understanding with horrible clarity. They weren't just searching randomly. The captain suspected exactly where Kalen was hidden. She started forward, but Captain Ironvale caught her arm gently but firmly. "Best to let them work, Miss Stormwind." Through the open door, she could hear boots on wooden floors, the scrape of furniture being moved. Her medical bag was still on the table. If they looked inside, they'd find the bloodied uniform pieces. Then she heard it, the distinctive creak of loose floorboards being lifted. "Captain," Sergeant Steelstride's voice carried clearly from inside. "You need to see this." Lyra closed her eyes, her heart breaking for the wounded man who'd trusted her with his life. When she opened them again, she found Captain Ironvale watching her with something that might have been pity. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, but instead of Kalen being dragged out in chains, Sergeant Steelstride emerged alone, carrying a small wooden box. "Root cellar's been used recently," he reported, "and I found this." He opened the box to reveal a collection of letters tied with blue ribbon, along with a small silver locket that Lyra's breath caught. Those were her parents' love letters, hidden away after their deaths because the memories were too painful to face. "Personal items," Captain Ironvale said after examining them. "Nothing suspicious." He handed the box back to her, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "Forgive the intrusion, Miss Stormwind. We had to be certain." The search continued for another 20 minutes, but they found nothing. No trace of Kalen, no evidence of his presence, beyond the mysterious horse. As the soldiers regrouped near their mounts, Lyra felt a mixture of relief and confusion that left her lightheaded. How was it possible they hadn't found him? "We'll be taking the horse," Captain Ironvale said, swinging into his saddle. "Evidence, you understand." Lyra nodded, not trusting her voice. "Miss Stormwind." The captain leaned down from his horse, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "If you ever need help, for any reason, you send word to the garrison, day or night." There was something in his tone that made her look up sharply, but his expression revealed nothing. After the patrol disappeared down the road, Lyra waited a full 10 minutes before returning to the cottage. Her hands shook as she lifted the floorboards, revealing the empty root cellar beneath. "Kalen?" she whispered into the darkness. "Nothing." She lit a candle and descended the narrow wooden ladder, her heart sinking with each step. The cellar was small and cramped, barely large enough for a man to crouch in. But it was also completely empty. Back in the kitchen, she noticed things she'd missed before. Her father's old traveling cloak was gone from its peg by the door. The spare boots he'd kept for patients too poor to afford shoes vanished. Even the small bag of journey bread she kept for emergencies had disappeared. Kalen had escaped somehow, but when? How? She'd been watching the door the entire time the soldiers were here. Then she noticed the window above her wash basin was open, the one that faced the backwoods, hidden from view by the lean-to stable. It was barely large enough for a man to squeeze through, especially an injured one. But a desperate man might manage it. A piece of paper lay folded on her table, her name written across it in an unfamiliar hand. With trembling fingers, she opened it. "My dear angel, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I couldn't let you risk more for my sake. You saved my life, and I'll carry the debt of that kindness until my dying day." The captain suspects more than he's saying. Trust him if you must, but trust carefully. Not all Union men are cut from the same cloth. I pray our paths cross again in a better world than this one. Your devoted servant, KV below his initials. He'd drawn a small sketch of a rose, not blooming, but budding, full of promise. Lyra sank into her father's chair, the letter pressed against her heart. 3 days he'd been here. 3 days of tending his wounds, sharing meals, feeling something bloom between them that had no name but felt real as sunrise. And now he was gone, vanished into the Missouri wilderness like morning mist. But as she sat there in the growing twilight, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't an ending, that it was the beginning of something far more dangerous than a simple rescue. 2 weeks passed like fevered dreams. Lyra threw herself into her work, tending Mrs. Henderson's rheumatism, delivering the Baker baby, setting young Tommy Garrett's broken arm when he fell from the hayloft. But through it all, Kaylin's letter remained pressed between the pages of her father's journal, and his sketch of the budding rose haunted her thoughts. She'd heard nothing of his fate. No reports of captured Confederate deserters, no whispers of violence in the valley. He'd simply vanished like smoke, leaving only the memory of storm-gray eyes and gentle hands that had trusted her completely. Until the night everything changed. Lyra woke to the sound of glass breaking. Not the sharp crash of an accident, but the deliberate smash of someone forcing entry. She sat up in her narrow bed, heart hammering, straining to hear over the autumn wind that rattled her cottage walls. Footsteps, heavy boots on her kitchen floor. Multiple men, moving with purpose. She reached for the derringer her father had taught her to use, checking that it was loaded. 2 shots. She'd have to make them count. Miss Lyra Stormwind. The voice was unfamiliar, rough with drink and something. Darker. We know you're in there. Come out peaceful-like, and nobody gets hurt. Lyra pulled on her wrapper and crept toward the kitchen, the pistol hidden in its folds. Through a gap in the quilt that divided her sleeping area, she could see 3 men silhouetted against the moonlight streaming through her broken window. They weren't Union soldiers. Their clothes were civilian, but their bearing spoke of military training. Confederate irregulars, perhaps, or deserters turned to banditry. The kind of men the war had broken and remade into something dangerous. We're looking for someone, the leader continued. He was a tall man with a grizzled beard and cold eyes that reflected the moonlight like a wolf's. Confederate officer by the name of Kaylin Viral. Word is you might know where to find him. Lyra's blood turned to ice. How did they know Kaylin had been here? And why were they hunting him? I don't know anyone by that name, she called out, keeping her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. The leader laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Now, that's interesting, because we have it on good authority that Lieutenant Viral, or should I say, Captain Viral, spent some time recovering from his wounds right here in your cozy little cottage. Captain, Kaylin had worn lieutenant's bars, but these men spoke of him as if he held higher rank. Another piece of the puzzle that was the man who'd called her Angel. You're mistaken, Lyra said, edging closer to the kitchen. If she could reach the back door, I don't think so. The leader nodded to his companions. Search the place. She's lying. They began overturning furniture with casual violence, dumping her father's books onto the floor, smashing her mother's china. Lyra watched decades of memories being destroyed and felt something hard and cold crystallize in her chest. Stop, she said, stepping into the kitchen with the derringer raised. This is my home. You have no right. The 3 men turned toward her, and she saw their faces clearly for the first time. The leader was older, maybe 50, with the weathered look of a career soldier. His companions were younger, one barely out of boyhood, the other maybe 30 with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. Well, the leader said, his eyes fixing on her weapon. The little angel has claws. Get out, Lyra said, thumb on the hammer. Now, can't do that, miss. You see, Captain Viral has something that belongs to us. Something valuable. And we figure you might know where he's gone. I told you, I don't know anyone by that name. The scarred man laughed. Finish, she's a terrible liar. Look at her, white as a sheet and shaking like a leaf. Please, the young one said, his voice almost apologetic. We don't want to hurt you. Just tell us where he went, and we'll be on our way. But Lyra could see the lie in their eyes. These men hadn't come just for information. They'd come to tie up loose ends, and she was one of them. I don't know where. He went, she said, and this time it was the truth. He left 2 weeks ago. I haven't seen him since. The leader, Finch, studied her face in the moonlight. You know what, miss? I believe you. But that don't change our problem. You see, you're the only person who can identify Captain Viral. The only witness to his activities in these parts. Understanding hit her like a physical blow. They weren't here to find Kaylin. They were here to silence her. Activities, she managed. Oh, didn't he tell you? Finch's smile was all teeth and malice. Our dear captain robbed a Confederate payroll train 3 months back. Made off with enough gold to buy a small plantation. Of course, that gold belonged to certain parties who don't take kindly to theft. The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. The deserter's brand. Kaylin's fine horse and quality boots despite wearing a torn uniform. His hesitation over his name. He wasn't just a deserter. He was a thief. Your bounty hunters, she breathed. Something like that. Finch stepped closer, and Lyra could smell whiskey on his breath. Now, the way we see it, you're a loose thread. Someone who might be able to point the authorities in our direction when we finally catch up to our quarry. I would never. Of course you wouldn't. You're a good Christian woman, ain't you? But good Christian women have a way of developing guilty consciences. Start thinking they ought to do their civic duty, report what they know. The scarred man had been edging around behind her while his leader talked. Lyra spun toward him, but he was too close, too fast. His hand clamped over her wrist, squeezing until she cried out and dropped the derringer. Now then, Finch said, picking up her weapon. That's better. We can talk civilized-like. But before he could say another word, a new voice cut through the night air like a blade. Let her go. Kaylin stood in the broken doorway, moonlight silvering his dark hair and casting sharp shadows across his face. He'd gained weight since leaving her cottage, and his wounds had healed enough for him to move with predatory grace. In his hands, he held a rifle with the easy competence of a man who knew how to use it. Well, I'll be damned, Finch breathed. If it ain't the captain himself. Come to rescue his little angel. I said let her go. Kaylin's voice was deadly calm, but Lyra could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his finger rested lightly on the trigger. Now, Captain. You're outnumbered 3-1, and we've got your lady friend here as insurance. The scarred man tightened his grip on Lyra's arm, making her gasp. Drop that rifle, and maybe we can work something out. There's nothing to work out, Garrick, Kaylin said, and Lyra realized he knew these men. You want the gold? Fine. It's buried under the old oak by Miller's Creek, 50 paces east of the lightning scar. Take it and leave. Finch's eyes lit. With greed. Now that's more like it. Though I have to wonder, why the sudden generosity? Last time we met, you seemed mighty attached to that gold. Last time we met, you hadn't threatened an innocent woman. Innocent? Garrick laughed harshly. She harbored a deserter and a thief. In wartime, that's treason. She didn't know what I was, Kaylin said. She saw a wounded man and showed Christian mercy. Nothing more. Oh, I think it was something more, Finch said slyly. I think our captain here has developed feelings for his little angel. Makes her valuable in ways beyond just being a witness. Lyra saw the muscle tick in Kaylin's jaw, saw his grip shift slightly on the rifle. The young bounty hunter had been inching toward the side wall, trying to get an angle on Kaylin from behind. Don't, she said suddenly, addressing Kaylin but looking at the young man. It's not worth it. Just give them what they want. Listen, to your woman, Captain, Finch said. She's got sense. That's when everything went wrong at once. The young bounty hunter made his move, diving for the rifle he'd propped against the wall. Garrick jerked Lyra harder against him, reaching for his pistol. And Finch raised the derringer he'd taken from her to Kaylin's rifle boomed in the confined space, and the young man crumpled. But Garrick's pistol was already clearing its holster, and Lyra could see death in his scarred face. Without thinking, she drove her elbow back into his ribs with all her strength. He doubled over, cursing, and she broke free just as his shot went wide, splintering the doorframe inches from Kaylin's head. Finch spun toward her with the derringer, but Lyra was already moving, diving behind her overturned table. The small pistol cracked, and she felt the burn of the bullet scoring her shoulder. Kaylin worked the rifle's lever, but Garrick was on him now, too close for the long gun to be effective. They grappled in the doorway, their shadows dancing wildly in the moonlight. Finch advanced on Lyra's hiding place, the derringer steady in his hand. One shot left, Angel, and this one won't miss. But as he rounded the table, Lyra's hand closed on a shard of her mother's broken china. Without hesitation, she slashed it across his gun hand, opening a gash from wrist to knuckle. He screamed and dropped the derringer, blood spattering the floor. Behind him, Kalen had gotten his hands on Garrick's throat. The scarred man's face was turning purple, his struggles growing weaker. "Stop," Finch gasped, clutching his bleeding hand. "Enough. You win." Kalen held his grip a moment longer, then released Garrick, who collapsed gasping. "The gold's where?" I said. "Take it and get out of Missouri. If I see any of you again, I'll kill you." Finch looked around the destroyed cottage, at his dead companion, his wounded hand, Garrick still struggling to breathe. His greed warred with his survival. Instinct and survival won. "This ain't over," he said, but there was no conviction in it. "Yes," Kalen said quietly, "it is." They left, half carrying their wounded, not looking back. Lyra and Kalen stood in the wreckage of her home, breathing hard, both bleeding from minor wounds, but alive. "You came back," she said finally. "I never really left." Kalen set down the rifle and moved toward her, his eyes soft with concern. "I've been watching from the woods, making sure you were safe. When I saw them break in." He reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing the torn sleeve where the bullet had grazed her shoulder. "Are you hurt?" "I'm alive," she said. "Thanks to you. Thanks to us both." His hand cupped her face gently. "Lyra, there's something I need to tell you. Something about who I really am." But before he could continue, hoofbeats thundered up the road. Through the broken window, they saw torches approaching, a full cavalry patrol moving fast. "They heard the shots," Kalen said grimly. "They'll be here in minutes." Lyra looked around her destroyed home, at the blood on the floor, at the man who'd risked everything to save her. The safe choice would be to let him run again, to claim she'd been attacked by random bandits. Instead, she reached for his hand. "When they get here," she said, her voice steady as stone, "you're my husband." Kalen's eyes widened at her words, but there was no time for questions. The cavalry patrol was already dismounting outside, their torches casting dancing shadows. Through the broken window, Lyra moved quickly, smoothing her torn wrapper and trying to make herself presentable despite the blood on her shoulder. "Follow my lead," she whispered, then raised her voice. "Help. Please, someone help us." Captain Thorn Ironvale was the first through the door, his pistol drawn and ready. His eyes swept the destroyed cottage, taking in the overturned furniture. The blood on the floor, the young bounty hunter's body sprawled near the wall. "Miss Stormwind." He holstered his weapon and moved toward her. "Are you injured? What happened here?" "Bandits," Lyra said, allowing her voice to shake with genuine fear. "3 men broke in, demanding money. They said they knew I sometimes treated wounded soldiers. Thought I might have gold hidden away." Captain Ironvale's gaze shifted to Kalen, who stood protectively beside her, the rifle still in his hands. "And you are?" Lyra felt Kalen tense beside her, but she spoke before he could answer. "My husband," she said, slipping her hand into his. "Darian Foxmere. He's been away." The lie came easier than it should have. Darian Foxmere. She'd chosen the name from her father's patient ledger, a man who died of fever 3 winters past. A man with no family to contradict their story. "Your husband?" Captain Ironvale's eyebrows rose. "Forgive me, Miss Stormwind, but I was under the impression you were unmarried." "We wed quietly," Kalen said, his voice steady despite the enormous risk they were taking. "Just before I left to handle some business in Kansas. Family matters." The captain studied them both, his intelligent eyes missing nothing. Lyra could feel his suspicion like a weight in the air, but she forced herself to lean into Kalen's side, playing the part of a grateful wife reunited with her protector. "And you arrived just in time to drive off these bandits?" Captain Ironvale asked. "Thank the Lord," Lyra breathed. "I thought they were going to kill me." Darian heard the commotion from the road and came running. One of the soldiers had been examining the young bounty hunter's body. "Captain, this one's been shot clean through the chest. Professional work." Captain Ironvale nodded slowly. "And the other 2 ran off when my husband fought back," Lyra said. "They took their wounded with them. Headed west, I think." It was a careful dance of truth and lies, using the bounty hunter's attack to explain away the violence while creating a new identity for Kalen. But Captain Ironvale was no fool, and Lyra could see him weighing every word. "Mr. Foxmere," the captain said finally, "you have the look of a military man. Where did you serve?" Lyra's heart stopped, but Kalen answered without hesitation. "Missouri Home Guard, sir. Before the war proper started. Discharged due to injury." He gestured to his left arm, which still bore the faint lines of his recent wounds. "I see, Captain." Ironvale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between them. "Well, it seems fortunate timing that you returned when you did. Though I'm curious why these bandits targeted your wife specifically." "Word gets around," Kalen said carefully. "A woman living alone, known to have medical supplies, maybe some coin from her doctoring. Desperate men don't need much excuse." The captain nodded, but something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "We'll need to take statements from you both for the official report." As they gave their carefully rehearsed account, more soldiers arrived to remove the body and search for clues about the bandit's identity. Lyra watched them work, her hands still clasped in Kalen's, both of them maintaining their performance of devoted spouses. But when Captain Ironvale pulled her aside for a private word, her heart began racing again. "Mrs. Foxmere," he said quietly, testing the new name, "I hope you'll forgive my professional curiosity, but your marriage seems rather sudden." "Love doesn't follow schedules, Captain," Lyra replied, hoping her voice carried the right note of gentle reproof. "Indeed." He studied her face in the lamplight. "I only mention it because there have been reports of a Confederate deserter in the area. A dangerous man, possibly involved in robbery. I'd hate for you to be taken advantage of by someone claiming to be something he's not." The warning was clear, but so was the escape he was offering her. Captain Ironvale suspected the truth, but was giving her a chance to reconsider, to claim deception and let them arrest Kalen. "I know my husband, Captain," she said firmly. "I know his heart." Something shifted in the captain's expression, surprise, perhaps, or resignation. "Very well. But Mrs. Foxmere, if you ever need help, for any reason, my offer stands." After the soldiers left, Lyra and Kalen stood alone in the ruins of her cottage. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and the weight of what they'd just done. "Wife?" Kalen said finally, a note of wonder in his voice. "It was the only way," Lyra said, suddenly uncertain. "To protect you." "I didn't think, Lyra." He turned to face her fully, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Look at me." She met his storm-gray eyes, seeing something there that made her breath catch. "You saved my life again tonight," he said softly. "Not just from those men, but from a lifetime of running. You gave me a name, a place to belong, a chance at something I never thought I could have. I gave you a lie. You gave me hope." His thumb brushed across her cheek, and she realized tears were falling. "The question is, was it just for show? Or could it be something real?" Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs. "Kalen, I don't even know who you really are. The gold, the bounty hunters, that brand on your arm, there's so much you haven't told me." "You're right." He stepped back, running a hand through his dark hair. "You deserve the truth. All of it." And so, as they worked together to right the overturned furniture and sweep up the broken china, he told her about the payroll train that had been carrying money meant to pay Confederate soldiers who were already dead or deserting. About his commanding officer's plan to pocket the gold while sending boys to die for a lost cause. About his decision to steal it first and disappear, earning the deserter's brand when they caught him the first time. "I never meant to keep it," he said, helping her nail boards over the broken window. "The gold, I mean. I was going to give it to the families of dead soldiers. Men whose wives and children were starving while officers got rich. But the bounty hunters found you first. They caught up to me in Arkansas. I managed to escape, but I was wounded in the fight. That's how I ended up here, bleeding on your doorstep like some half-dead stray." Lyra paused in her sweeping, studying his face. "And now? What happens to the gold?" "Now they can have it," Kalen said without hesitation. "All of it. If it buys us a life together, it's worth more than any treasure." The cottage was as repaired as they could manage in one night, but it would never be quite the same. Like them, Lyra thought. Changed by violence and choice, scarred but somehow stronger A.S. dawn painted the sky pink and gold. They sat together on her front steps, watching the sun rise over the Missouri Valley. Kalen had changed into some of her father's old clothes. And in the morning light, he looked like what he was claiming to be, a farmer returned from business, ready to build a life with his wife. "We'll have to make it legal," Lyra said quietly. "Find a preacher, get proper papers. People will expect it." "Is that what you want?" Kalen asked. "A real marriage, not just a story to fool the soldiers." Lyra thought of everything she'd learned about this man, his gentleness with wounded animals, his willingness to sacrifice himself for her safety, the way he'd called her angel from the first moment they met. She thought of the long years she'd spent alone, tending others but never being tended herself. "Yes," she said simply. "I want it to be real." Kalen's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something, small and green, a rose cutting, carefully wrapped in damp cloth. "I found this growing wild near Miller's Creek," he said. "Thought maybe we could plant it by the front steps. Something beautiful to replace what was broken." Lyra took the cutting, its thorns pricking her fingers gently. It was barely more than a stick with a few leaves, but she could see the potential in it, the promise of blooms to come, of beauty growing from barren ground.